we've hit record or something reasonably close to that. This episode, as we talked about last time, I think we're going to dive right into, and partially because we're a little time constrained because of how our reality has been lately. And we'll go into this do's and don'ts for working with a customer. Some of the things they like, because there's so many ways to try to like cut corners and do stuff. And there are some things you really don't want to do. And there are some things that look good and then they don't. And it's how do you extract yourself from that? And I have like recent pain points that I'm still bleeding from that are in these kinds of things. And it's also some ways to maybe like, pitching your way back out of that. Once you found yourself, you like dug a little bit of a hole or maybe a very big hole. What are some things you can do to get out of that? Sounds good to you?
Yeah. And it also relates not just to our own consulting jobs, but this also can apply to projects that you're on with companies. So pay close attention to this because this applies to everyone.
So yeah, spoiler, you may be talking about that while I talk about the other one. Well, hello and welcome back. We are here continuing once again the developer journey. We are Developreneur, Building Better Developers podcast. I am Rob Broadhead. I'm one of the founders of Developreneur, also a founder of RB Consulting, where we take your technology nightmare and turn it into a sweet little dream as we use simplification, automation, and integration to take all of those nasty systems and all those different websites and all those different logins and find ways to coalesce that into something that is a lean, sleek machine. Not necessarily a lean, sleek machine, but maybe he is. We'll find out. On the other side is Michael, and share with me what's a good and a bad thing that's happened to you recently, along with your general introduction.
Hey everyone, my name is Michael Malash. I'm one of the founders of Developreneur and co-founder of Envision QA, where we help small to mid-sized businesses and clinicians analyze, review their systems. We do assessments, and we help build custom software to make your business run more efficient. Good and bad. So along this topic that we're going to be talking about today, one of the good things that I ran into recently is I just got done doing a wonderful assessment with the customer. We kind of laid out where we're going with our current project. And right now, there are no blind spots and good communication back and forth and documentation. Bad side, I had a recent project that went off the rails, and we are still in the trenches trying to figure out what went wrong and dig ourselves out. How about you?
Let's see. Well, I'm going to go good work related is, sometimes you have these customers that have they're ongoing customers. And these guys, we've worked with them now for a couple of years, and they just came back with a cool little project. They're like, hey, we have this thing. It's going to be a nice little 20, 30-hour project, maybe fun little stuff. So those are always neat. It's nice to just be able to jump into a nice little project, well-defined. The requirements list is a couple of bullet points and you're off and running. Bad thing actually happened coming back from a client visit yesterday. Go to fill the car with gas, and it rejected my card like 8 times. Turns out that because we are about to travel and there was a phone call made to try to say, hey, we're about to travel soon. And my wife didn't have the right, password or whatever. They labeled it as a at-risk account and shut down everything. So I had to it was basically, I was going to have to call, but by the time it's a gas station. So by the time you call, it's like, no, it's too much of a pain in the butt. So, swapped cards, got that working, but it was after like a 15-minute call with the support guy trying to explain what was going on and say, here's what we want to do, and fine. And they have to verify you 18 different ways, and you have to draw blood. It's these things. I get security for you people that are in the risk world and things like that, but just like everything else, sometimes security is just too much of a headache. Speaking of headaches, let's dive into this thing about customers, and we're going to talk about customers and when you really want to help a customer, or sort of similar thing is when they're trying to find ways to get something done on a budget or at a lower cost. Now, one of the things I'm going to sort of go into a little bit of the don'ts, and this is it's going to sort of combine with some of the things that you can do. Now, one of the things you can do is a lot of times, particularly if it's work on an existing system, or even honestly, if it's creating a new system, is you can look at the requirements, whatever state they are in, and you can scope down. You can be like, hey, this is what we can do. And so, a good example is recently I had one where it's like, hey, there's this big picture of stuff we want to do. Cool. We look at it and we get a little bit into it and find out that, well, some of those things were underestimated. And we get a little further along and there's some adjustments and things are underestimated. Now, the next thing you know, you've gone from a little project to a very long project. And now the scope's growing and the cost is growing. And, customers not happy because they were trying to get something small. And what I want to talk a little bit about in that situation is a reset. Now, there's two things. One thing we've talked about a lot is that communicate, is make sure that you are regularly providing feedback and say, this is what we're working on. This is what we're going to be working, this is what we've done this week. This is what we're doing next week or today and what we're going to do tomorrow, things like that. So they know where are you at? Where's your focus? Where's your head at? That gives them an opportunity time and time again to step in and say, hey, this is taking longer than we wanted it to. They can pull the plug on it. They can say, hey, let's stop or let's hold off. Now, sometimes what you need to do though, is you're going to get into a point where you are skipping ahead on some of this stuff. So maybe it's like, hey, initially, this is what we were going to do. And we didn't really need well-defined requirements for it. And you may get to a certain point where you realize that, oh, now we've changed a little bit or a lot, and we need to almost reset. We need to go back to, we need firm requirements. And that's where that thing keeps going on. Sometimes it's like, if you're in an agile project or something like that, it's easy to get into something that's just like adjust, add, and the next thing you've just been like cranking through sprint after sprint after sprint. Sometimes you need to step back, and say, wait a minute, we need a finish line. We keep moving the finish line. We have a moving target. So instead of let's keep, and we like to do that. We like to get that feedback. We like to say, oh, I'll fix that. I'll throw that in. We'll change that. We'll do this. We'll blah, blah, blah. And the next thing you know, this thing is just keeps going. Instead, rein it in and say, okay, what do we need? What is done? What does done look like? What are the requirements that we really need? Let's refine those things. Let's make sure, define those, be very precise with them and say, okay, this is what we're working toward. And it's a little bit a change sometimes in going from an agile approach to more of a waterfall approach because with agile, you're sort of you're working as you go. With waterfall, you really have said, this is where we're at. And when we're done, this is where we're going to be. And you're essentially eliminating the introduction of change into that. Now you can still do it. You can have, change requests and things like that. But now you can do something that is very well defined. And it gives them, sometimes this is the comfort that not only the customer, but you need in order to say, okay, I'm going to work 2 weeks on this or 8 weeks on it or 18 years on it, whatever your time frame is. And this is what it's going to cost. And this is where we're going to be. And then along the way, you make sure, just like you did along the way here, you're communicating, here's where we are, here's where we are, here's where we are. So you should have milestones within there. And now you take this big thing that is amorphous and changing, and you basically simplify it down. And sometimes it is. It's the idea of, okay, we're not going to take on the whole elephant. We're going to take on a couple of bites, and we're going to deal with that. And those things, although they can be, we'll call them those difficult conversations with a customer, because sometimes you're having to rein stuff in or reset things. And sometimes there's even a little mea culpa because you're saying, well, yeah, we were able to do that, but we assumed, and it's, we sort of thought that we could just do that because we were making adjustments and you were good with it. Okay, you're not. Your budget is now getting constrained, and you may bring this to them, or they may bring it to you, or there may be deadlines that that have now become more apparent or more firm. Go in and address those things. Be honest and say, okay, what do we need to get to? What is our runway at this point? And you basically do it's almost like a project reset. As you say, all right, what do we need to get done? What are the requirements? What can we get done? How do we find a way to squeeze those in? And if you can't squeeze all those requirements into the time frame they need, then you got to pull requirements out and say, okay, how do we do that? Either we open the box up a little bit more so we can throw more requirements in, or we take away some of those requirements or simplify some of those, which is often a great approach to take, where you say, we're going to get you like a version 1, and it's going to be much more simple. That'll get you across the finish line. You've got something you can work with, particularly if it's a company that's a startup or something. So it's like, hey, this is your MVP. You can take that, you can move forward. And then that allows them to bootstrap moving forward. Now, I know that's a lot, and I'm sure Michael's got 100 things to work on, or he may go a completely different direction. So I'm going to go ahead and throw this to you. Apologies if I took all the oxygen out of the room.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. So there are times when we talk about waterfall and agile, but if you're starting a project for the first time, there's got to be a little bit of waterfall at the beginning with the requirements gathering, because unless it is a small project, there either has to be some form of assessment at the beginning to understand where they're currently at, what environment are you walking into, in order to build the requirements or even accept the requirements that they're giving you. It's like, hey, I want this. Well, okay, what do you have? And is what you're asking for really what you need? So you kind of have that give and take at the beginning. The story I'm going to kind of discuss here is one Rob came into later in our career, where we worked at a place a long time ago. The company had just come out of bankruptcy when I went to work for them. And we weren't necessarily under the requirements constraint. We were under a budget constraint. We were a very slim team trying to do a lot of work very quickly to reduce costs with software over manpower. So we were essentially, it was kind of a pincer attack of trying to eliminate workers, but keep the same processes in place, but with technology, so fewer people could do the work. The problem we had was no one really understood a lot of what was going on in different areas of the company, because we had gone into bankruptcy. There had been some turnover, and we ran into a particular problem where we wanted this particular software built. We're like, sure, let's throw something up quickly. We did. It was accepted well. And we went from agile, but we ran into a situation where the business's mind was, we can go faster if we just copy and paste this project again and again and again. Forgo the requirements. We have this, we can take this, and we can just tweak it. In an instance like that, you might be trying to take a square peg and cram it into a round hole, and you've introduce complexities that you don't need. You've run into things where, like Rob said, you're trying to do more than what is really requested. And in those situations, you need, as a developer, manager, whatever, to look at the situation you're in. Does it make sense to copy and paste a project? Or does it make more sense to look at the requirements you actually need for this new project and borrow things from the other project? Or, do you need to just copy and paste? Sometimes that makes sense. Sometimes it makes more sense to just cherry pick the things you need and build a new project that way. The problem we ran into by the fourth iteration of this was we were now had common front end pieces copied and pasted through all these applications, and they wanted to do a site-wide change. Well, the complexity went from, here we just changed the CSS, to now we have to touch, recompile, redeploy, retest 6 different applications. The cost just went through the roof. So where we had made all those cost savings at the beginning, we seriously got impacted at the end. So there is some benefits to a little bit of requirements and scope at the beginning, but as you go through the projects, you need to reset. You need, even if you're doing waterfall, especially if you're doing agile, do those burn downs at the end of the sprint. Are you on track? Are we moving the needle forward, or are we stuck? And if you're stuck, start looking at, what are the must-haves? What do we need to do? Not the nice-to-haves. Start removing those nice-to-haves, push those out to future sprints, and focus on getting a viable product out that is stable, and that is functional. Interestingly enough, if you go the test-driven development approach and you start with requirements and you build out from that, yes, that's a little bit waterfall, but if you do that in the previous sprint, if you have a good project manager that can go get that for you, you start each sprint with a fairly well-defined set of requirements and you can get the work done. Everyone knows what they need to do. They know what they're agreeing to do. And the customer also should know what they're getting at the end of the sprint.
Now, one other thing I want to bring up in working with a customer that's budget constrained. Usually we are the more expensive resource to use. Now, I've had multiple situations where I've worked with customers, particularly startup kind of situations, but sometimes even larger organizations where, and sometimes there's some of the best ones where it's like, it's going to cost you, $10,000 to get this thing done. However, if you go off and do some of the work, then it's going to cost you $2,000. Yeah, and I'm just making numbers up. And a lot of times though, I've walked into projects where I have worked with a customer and said, okay, which goes to that whole assessment idea. Sometimes you can get into that even in an initial call and say, hey, I can do an assessment for you. It's going to take, whatever it is. It's going to take 40 hours of my time or whatever your rate is. And then I will come back and I will help you. I will have for you a requirements document or, maybe a project plan of milestones and things like that. However, if that's too much for them from a monetary point of view, then you can push it back on them and say, but you could do this. If you walk through these things and you build the requirements document and you build the requirements out, then I can take that. That saves me from doing it, which means it saves you from being billed from me for doing that. The caution I would say with that is when you put something on a customer, it is very hard to hold their feet to the fire. So if you say, all right, go ahead and do this, and they come back and they have gaps, it really can become challenging because now you're in a situation where they quote, saved that money by doing that. But if there's gaps, if they miss something, somewhere along the way now it's sort of your problem because you weren't able to build the solution they wanted, but it does go back to improper requirements. Same kind of thing. If you want to sometimes, and a lot of times, there's some level of testing that is expected for user acceptance testing. You have to have an investment of time from a customer. They can't just rubber stamp it and go, this big thing that took you a year to build, they can't spend 30 minutes and say, yep, it's all good. Looks great. Because it's going to end up, they're going to miss something. So you need to make sure sometimes that you handhold them through it. Sometimes that you even walk them through what is expected and then let them know if they are not capable of it for whatever reason, whether it's they don't have the bandwidth or it's just not their skill set or whatever it is, or they then say, okay, the alternative is more time and more money from, yourself, whoever that contractor is. So there is that give and take. The caution to that is just making sure that when you start shifting that kind of stuff around, that also shifts responsibilities and ownerships and things like that. And that can cause you problems, particularly now if it's directly with a customer and you're working with that customer, it's great. If you start getting a middleman in there, I've even talked about, I think back in some of my season of mistakes, when I talked about that, there was one where I had exactly that problem where I was working with the middleman was giving a different story to the customer, and it ended up being a complete train wreck because everybody wasn't clear. We weren't all on the same page that this is what's going on. This is what the expectations are. And so this is I'll say it's like a bonus, more advanced consulting kind of move sometimes, but sometimes you need to really, sort of push the customer and address them and put requirements on them and ownership and such things to them. And I've seen this with, little side hustle things up to big organizations where the customer there are things maybe even in the master services agreement, the statement of work, it's expectations, and they fail those. And then you end up in trouble because now they have not followed through with what needed to be done. Usually that means it falls back on you because they're going to point to you and say, well, why isn't this working? And it's really hard to say, well, because you didn't do your job, because you didn't do what was expected of you. And now, you cut corners and now things didn't come out. But this goes back to regular communication and making sure you're clear and requirements and who owns them and who does what. Those kinds of things can help you out quite a bit. And don't be afraid to call your client out. When you're doing those regular communications, if you're not seeing progress from what they need, a lot of time that's like data they need to give you, or contact information they need to give you, or feedback on some sort of a form or something like that, and just say, hey, I need this because your lack is slowing us down. And I know that feels like it's a little harsh or whatever, but it is something that as you get further into it, that is part of, even though they won't say it, they're not necessarily saying we're paying you to do this, but some of it is that what you're bringing to the table is helping them manage their projects better. Closing thoughts?
So one of the things that I've talked about this before is, as you're working with the customer, as you're working with the client or your boss, if the tasks you're getting, the requirements you're getting have a lot of what ifs, have a lot of assumptions, a lot of if, then, but without the then, you need to go back and have a conversation before you start the work. If there are gaps in the requirements to the point where you would have to make an assumption, you need to have that hard talk with the customer, with your boss. Because if you go into the work with assumptions and they're not clearly defined assumptions or defined risk, then you're going to be in trouble down the road.
That is excellent little parting thought. But you guys will not be in trouble down the road because you're listening to us, because you're going to learn more, and hopefully you will give us some feedback so we won't be in trouble down the road, and we'll have some great topics for you. You can shoot us an email at info@developreneur.com. You can head out there, developreneur.com, and we've got a contact us form. You can go leave us feedback here, whether you're watching us on YouTube or whether you are listening on the podcast. Wherever you gather your podcast, feel free to leave us some sort of review, feedback and things like that, because we will take a look at that. We utilize that for future episodes and even future seasons. That being said, we're going to wrap this one up and let you get back to it. Go out there and have yourself a great day, a great week, and we will talk to you next time. Bonus thought from me. This sort of like you sort of touched on this. If you're going through a project, whether it's where you're at work or side hustle or whatever it is, and things are not going right, don't keep doing the same thing. There's sometimes it's like, okay, I think we're almost there, and this is actually probably the hardest, is when it's like we're almost there, so we're going to stumble through this one more time, and then we'll be fine, and we'll fix it on the backside. And it is very difficult to do that, particularly if you're being pushed to we got to have this done. We got, we're on a deadline, we're behind a deadline or whatever it is. But even if it's small changes, you need to be making changes along the way. Because if you keep doing the same thing, don't expect that you're going to get different outcomes. And now, luckily, this is where you can get some things where you can get very smart as a better developer. Then maybe if you're struggling and you're like, I don't know how to get out of this thing, you say things just don't seem to be working. Do one thing at a time. Keep the changes small and manageable so that you can look at it and say, did that change move the needle in the right direction? If it did, awesome. And then if you have to go through, especially if you're doing something you're iterating a lot, if you're going through and you're doing something every day working on this project and there's a pain point there, then every day tweak it a little bit. And then if it works, if it moves the needle in the right direction, great, incorporate that in. If it doesn't, then push that aside and try something else so that you can get a list of here's what we need to do to get out of this. And sometimes you can do that while it's a bad analogy, but it's basically while you're going off the cliff, you can be sitting there riding the train off the cliff down to the valley below and be walking through some of these things so that you can say, okay, I'm working on this. How about this? How about this? How about that? so that hopefully you can, maybe somewhere along the way, just to keep some sort of analogy, is find a parachute that will allow you to not totally, crash and burn. But in general, if you're sitting there and it's like, you like, okay, we're going to do this, and you come back 2 weeks later, and it's like, all right, we're sort of in the same place that we were, then you need to change. If you've moved, but you haven't moved enough, then it's time to take a look. Well, what did we do? Where did we make maybe those small changes, so that we can incorporate those, and then assess a couple things. Say, all right, let's make some more, because if we've at least moved, if we've at least made progress, then we just want to make sure we're making better progress, whatever our next cycle is, whether it's a day, a week, a month, however you do it. That's my little bonus. Yours?
So interestingly enough, ran into a situation like that recently. And one other takeaway, I'll give you two things real quick. So first, if you think of your development cycle like a phishing attack, if you get into the point where you're getting all these urgent emails and like, hey, do this quickly, that leads to mistakes, that leads to problems, that leads to information being given away that shouldn't be given away, or essentially a project going off the rails. In addition to that, with you kind of going off that cliff, get the code or look at where you're at with the requirements. Can you get to a point where you can do a clean cutoff and at least get a release out so that you can start fresh, like reset? I know Rob mentioned, getting to a point where you can kind of reset within, but also you have to think releases. In an agile world, we want to keep that continuous integration, continuous deployment. If you get to the point where you've missed one release, but we're almost there to that, and then you miss the next release. No, get the code to a stable place where you can get the code out. If it's a new feature, disable the feature, push the code out. Keep working on the feature. But keep the code stable enough that you can keep fixing things while doing new work. And the code can still go out the door. It can be difficult, it can be trying, but if you can keep that mindset, you'll be mentally happier, and your customer will be happier because they will still see incremental changes. Even if the big piece keeps moving a little bit, they're still seeing work is getting done.
And that's really, just to follow that one up, it is easy to get into that firefighting mode where it's just like, we're going to rush, get it out. Very, all of a sudden your development cycles shrink to nothing. And it's just basically like, you're slinging code, a couple of tests, and boom, you're off and running. But now what you end up doing is each of those iterations, you are destabilizing stuff behind there because you're cranking this stuff out. You're not doing a full suite. This is where it would be, although it's expensive, it is nice to have it from the start. Regression tests, CI/CD, and a lot of these pieces. The challenge is if you've got a resource-strapped customer, some of those things they're not able to do. And there may come a point where you say, look, this has gotten to a level where we have to back up, and we were trying to avoid this, but we have to. It's sort of like, we were trying to avoid rebuilding the engine to your car, but we've done all this and we can't. We must rebuild it. Anything we do from here is just, it's good money after bad, basically. And so sometimes that's the thing to do, is just halt and go, okay, we need to take a different approach. And it can be painful. It can be expensive because you've gone through this, but it's like, hey, we worked with you. You tried to cut we tried to cut costs with you. We tried to work where we can, but there's more. It's like, it wasn't feasible. It's like we rolled the dice and snake eyes. We didn't get it. It's like sometimes that happens. Sometimes you roll the dice and it's okay. Sometimes you roll the dice and it does not work out well. And that's part of software. If you just make sure that's where, like, as you're communicating along the way, it's like, okay, we can do this, but we're varying from what we would prefer to do. And when you get to that point, then you at least say it's not comfortable. It's like, hey, sorry, it didn't work out. We took the risk. We took a couple shots at it. Didn't work. Now we need to back up. We need to go the low risk approach, straighten it out, get it back on track. That being said, I guess I'll give you a parting shot before we wrap this one up. Is there anything else you want to throw out there in the bonus section here?
Now, I think we've kind of extended this one a little bit longer than normal, but if you guys find yourself in these situations, take a break, take a step back, review where you're at, even if you're in firefighting mode, take a few minutes and understand why you're in firefighting mode. Because even a mental snapshot of where you're at can help move the dial forward.
Sometimes it's a few minutes. Sometimes it's going to be a little longer than that, particularly if you get into the consecutive late nights, no sleep, that kind of stuff. Sometimes you need to step away it's going to take a couple of days because you need to reset, you need to get healthy, and you need to be able to get out of it enough to be able to give it a good assessment, as opposed to just being in the middle of it when you're not that much, you're not that good to anybody. So that being said, hopefully you're not in this situation. You're having a grand old time and you're like, what the heck? What are you guys talking about? My software problems are non-existent. All of my stuff gets done perfectly. We never have bugs. We always release on time. I want to talk to you if you're that person, because we got to figure out what you're doing that allows you to do this thing that a lot of us don't think happens. We see it. We're like, all we see is all of the challenges. We do not see perfection anywhere around us. As always, you can shoot us an email, info@developreneur.com. Check stuff out here. Come here. You get bonus, like extra bonus stuff like this sometimes when we go a little bit long, but that should help you out a little bit. We're always happy with feedback, questions, comments, or if you've got your own little bonus material stuff that you want to throw out on these, we would love to hear it. That being said, go out there and have yourself a good one. We will talk to you next time.